Nature of the law and Indigenous peoples. Definition of Indigenous peoples. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues defines Indigenous peoples as of those who inhabited a country or a geographical region at the time when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrived. The following characteristics are what the UN further establishes to be definitive of Indigenous peoples: unique languages, knowledge systems and beliefs, processes but possesses invaluable knowledge of practices for the sustainable management of natural resources, special relation to and use of their traditional land, fundamental importance for their collective physical and cultural survival as peoples. Jose R. Martinez Cobo's study on the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations in 1981, or the Martinez Cobo study, offered working definition of indigenous communities, peoples, and nations, plus introduced concept of self-identification and community acceptance, historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, considered themselves distinct from other source sectors of societies now prevailing in those territories, determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations ancestral territories and their ethnic identity in accordance to their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. There is no single criteria in Australian law to identify someone as an Indigenous person. Australian government current definition of Indigenous Australians are people who are of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, identify as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin, and are accepted as such in the communities in which they live or have lived. Considering the diversity of Indigenous peoples, an official definition of Indigenous has not been adopted by an UN system body. Modern understanding of this term by the UN is based on the following: self-identification as Indigenous peoples at the individual level and accepted by the community as their member, historical continuity with pre-colonial and or pre-settler societies, strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, distinct social, economic, and political systems, distinct language, culture, and beliefs, form non-dominant groups of society, resolve to maintain and reproduce the ancestral environments and systems as distinctive peoples and communities. Loss of the rights of Indigenous peoples over time. Indigenous peoples have sought recognition of their identities, their way of life, right to traditional lands, territories, and natural resources. These struggles are caused due to colonization by technologically advanced powers, overconsumption of the world's natural resources, world wars and conflict, the complicated politics, independence movements of decolonization. It was colonization and the loss of land that primarily catalyzed the loss of the rights of Indigenous peoples over time. First Portugal and Spain, and then later the Netherlands, the UK, France, and the remaining European powers spread out through South America, North America, Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. Many of the pre-existing legal codes of Indigenous peoples came into conflict with the legal codes of Europeans. The European settlers typically ignored the legal and political traditions of the Indigenous peoples. Hence the term, which remains in use today to describe Indigenous laws, as customary, where Anglo-Australian law is established as the true law. In the wake of settlement of these new worlds by European governments, European and European descendant businessmen, explorers, furriers, trappers, and miners expanded deeper into the territories of Indigenous peoples and accelerated the effective destruction of the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. In Australia, farmers pushed the frontier further and further north, stripping the Indigenous inhabitants of the ability to hunt and live off the land, and severing their cultural and spiritual connections to the land. South America, farmers and miners could clear Amazon for sugarcane plantations and grazing land, forcing Indigenous people off their native habitats and into the most remote parts of the Amazon. This disrupted the food supply and caused intertribal conflict with the established residents of the land they were encroaching on, affecting the tribe's well-being. There are ideological differences. Difference in legal, political, commercial, and ethical systems have led to conflict and injustice for Indigenous people. The settler/colonial societies were, with occasional exceptions, essentially commercially focused, mercantile, capitalist empires. When we think of First Nations, Aboriginal, and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we understand that they were more nomadic and emphasize the value of nurturing and connecting with the land and sustainable living and kinship. For example, the early history of the contact between the Maori people of New Zealand and European settlers. The Maori living in communal organizations known as iwi owned all property communally. The British, as they bought property or land from the Maori owners, sought to assign property rights by dividing them amongst the individual members of the iwi, as is customary under British law. However, the iwi weren't set up for this kind of property arrangement. It led to the Maori being in a far worse bargaining position than they would have been had the British recognized a system of property ownership. Consequently, the iwi received far from the proper return for their property. Remote regions. People who lived in remote regions, for example, the Inuit of high Arctic, particularly Greenland, the indigenous tribes of northern Russia and the highland tribes of New Guinea were untouched by colonialism, since the land was too hostile for easy settlement, and resource companies were deterred by the expense involved in building mines in these areas. This continued into the outbreak of World War II that led to an enormously intense use of resources, such as oil and steel, for the construction and operation of the machinery of war. This heightened the demand for protecting previously disregarded stretches of land from invasion by enemy forces. Vast stretches of far northern Europe, Southeast Asia jungle, and the islands north of Japan, where native peoples had been allowed to live and govern themselves, essentially autonomously, now played host to troops, armaments, and consequently the laws and regulations of these powerful nations. For example, the Inuit in Greenland lived there without any contact with Europe since 1300. Denmark sent settlers to the island in the middle of the 18th century, but the Danish settlers largely confined themselves to the trading post of Godthab, modern day Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, and the Inuit population was left largely undisturbed. However, during World War II, secret German outposts were built and detected on Greenland. In response, the US built a number of outposts there, driving the Germans out. The ideal place due to its proximity to the North Pole, but it was also excellent for radar based missile detection systems, which was significant in post World War II and Cold War. After making an offer to purchase Greenland, which was then rejected by the Danish government, the US negotiated to build Thue Air Base. Construction of this base in 1953 required the forced relocation of many Inuit from their traditional lands to the urban center Nuuk. This partly forced urbanization of the Inuit people that led to unnecessary difficulties, such as the construction of Block P, which was built between 1965 and 1966 and housed approximately 1% of the entire country's population in the building. The large communal housing building failed to cater for the needs of its inhabitants, especially the Inuits. Legal recognition of indigenous peoples. In accordance with the international law, if a country was considered vacant, it should be settled, and the laws of the colonizing nation would apply immediately. However, if the indigenous people were recognized as having sovereignty through self governance or cultivation of the land, the colonizing nation needed to conquer the country or at least enter into a treaty. A key example is the Treaty of Waitangi. In the 6th of February, it was signed in the 6th of February 1840. Interactions between the Maori and foreign whalers, sealers, traders, and missionaries were brought about conflict. By 1830, greater than 1,000 European ships per year were visiting New Zealand. Tensions that French would annex New Zealand also began to emerge. British humanitarians and missionaries advocated for Maoris to avoid harmful effects that British colonial authority had in Australia, Africa, and across Asia, which discouraged land sales and purchased lands and allied with tribes to keep land away from the hands of colonial powers. James Bubsey drafted Declaration of Independence. 34 Maori chiefs signed it. Declaration of Independence, in terms of terminology and translations, were interpreted different. British viewed it as a chance to make New Zealand a British administered nation. Maori as a declaration of full independence. Self-determination will be defined, supported by Article 3 of UNDRIP, UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 1 of ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant of Social and Cultural Rights. A great viewing is A Fair Go for Self-Determination by Vincent Renhouse TED Talk in Canberra. Indigenous perspectives on what self-determination is like and how it can be advocated for and put into place in his experience as a Native American from the Navajo Nation. He imparts insight into an Australian audience on what change can look like for Indigenous peoples across the world. Self-determination refers to the ability of an individual, a group of individuals, or a people to govern themselves, make decisions about how they are governed, what legal system is put into place, and what is the best and most effective education system and health system. Through the Declaration of the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN stresses the right to self-determining. The right to self-determination is a fundamental right. General Assembly of the UN passed resolution in 1514. In 1960, which declared that the subjection of peoples to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights, that all people have the right to self-determination. They freely determine their political status, freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, and any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and the territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purpose and principles of the Charter of the UN. Although the UN has declared in both the ICESCR and the ICCPR that self-determination is a fundamental human right, there have been a number of political and legal factors, both practical and ideological, that have limited the application of this idea to the circumstances of Indigenous peoples. At the Indigenous level, at the international level, there has been a distinct distinction made between societies in which colonized people make up a majority and those in which they make up a minority of the population. Those who make up the majority have found it easier to obtain the right to self-determination, such as Kenya and India. Those with colonized as a minority find it harder, such as Australia, US, and Canada. Here are some syllabus questions for you to try out. Define Indigenous peoples. Outline the loss of rights of Indigenous peoples globally. Outline the need for legal recognition of Indigenous peoples. Explain the difficulties faced by Indigenous peoples in determining their own future.